Who's that?
Saint Michael.
Who is it?
Saint Michael.
And what did he do?
He cast Satan out of paradise.
Goodbye.
Antigones continued his pilgrimage. His pulsing oral implants identified the distant cacophony of raucous conflict, their echoes swallowed up by the muddy, sludging swamp. The tone poem of a blade scratched along the ribbed instrument of a larynx, the staccato percussion of mass-reactive shells, the snared drum of flesh pieces falling limply into the brackish waters, the broken chorus of bassi profundi screams. The ear-splitting, flesh-flaying, bone-mulching instrumentation of the abyssal choir, reaching yet another crescendo as they approached their prize. Antigones could no longer hear the keening ethereal voice that called to him across the desolation. His soul clawed at the memory of it, burned out neurons and frayed nerve fibers fizzing to the echoed sounds of tantalizing novelty. He could feel necrotic centers of his brain spark into fitful life, the sweet agony of diseased, useless tissue, the sloughing off of useless rot that gave way to the cleansing madness of new experience. The long, drawn-out scream that mirrored the birth of the Dark Prince. Cosmic radiation funneled and purified into one new sound. Blood gathered as tears around the sinking blackness of his eyes. Trembling sensation overpowered a stretched-out nervous system, already on the brink of catastrophe. A low moan emitted from the circular vox grill that had replaced his mouth. A defective rendition of that ghostly sound, so monstrous in its imperfection that Antigones almost ripped the implant from his face in his disgust. He fell to his knees, convulsing at the memory, planting his hands into the rapacious mud and sinking deeper into the murk and fog of his broken mind. He briefly savored the small explosions of swamp bubbles popping beneath his weight, the mosquito whines and the buzzing wings of carrion insects, the churning slosh rippling over squalid bracken and other fetid ferns. His eyes strained against their sockets, two screaming orbs squeezing against the iron bars of an excruciation cell. Antigones remembered the perfect silence of the Xenos Durahacks, the dizzying corruption of sonic sound that violated their sacred temples, and replaced the quiet with the endless howling of the warp. The war for Otinius IV, unremarkable but for the mournful screams of a mortal woman, and the moment where her vocal cords swelled and inflamed to replace her wails with weak, vibrating gasps. The boiling of oceanic Zerapast, and the thunderous whispered hiss of an entire sea burning into murderous steam. Antigones briefly returned to himself. His limbs had sunk beneath the semi-solid mud. For all his transhuman strength, he could not remove them. The strain of a suckering, puckering pressure pressing against his armor. Flies gathered around him, seeking orifices upon which to vomit and feast. A stinking wind fluttered through the ferns, distracting Antigones with its traces of blood and acrid promethium. He remembered the long scream of craft-world Albanayak, the path of sound that fissured the psychoactive wraithbone and shattered apart the stones that gathered souls for Slanesh. Antigones howled. The amplification of his vox grill blasted apart the mud and the stagnant water, causing small tsunamis of fetid liquid to cascade in every direction. As the discordant sound violated the deadened smoothness of the swamp, he made to stand, wrenching his arms from the clamp embrace of mud and sending aftershocks through the sludge. The flies that buzzed about him scattered in a black fury. Those that had landed on his vox grill were pulped, falling limply to the water. Antigones took a step, and then another. A yearning cry, faint and trembling, reached out across the wastelands in response to his scream. Antigones shivered. It was the same, otherworldly sound he sought. Holding out an ethereal hand, Antigones felt his soul reach back, its claws a glaring mishmash of impossible color. It gave him strength against the ennui of mud, and on he went. He crossed an ocean of soundless, colorless hell, dull, tepid greens that murked into sludging, diseased brown, ferns sinking without grace into the depths of draining mud. Diseased browns that faded into gloomy grey waters, that snatched at the sun and usurped its light into a dull pallor. Sloshing marshlands that grated to asinine emptiness through oral implants, shedding into the horror of Antigone's mind, rhythmic, repetitive resonances that spoke of sweet surrenders to the slushing swamp. The black pools of his eyes swallowed the fluttering life spark of 100 buzzing fauna, floundering in the sinking void of his entropic soul. He stumbled like a blind man in the mud and the mire, a ship adrift in the warp horror of 1,000 atrocities, led only by the call of that ethereal lighthouse, the sound light that called to him from across a blackening chasm of fused nerve endings and exhausted sensation. Antigone's remembered the degradation of Faraday Mundus, and the shrieking soul terror of the red-robed priests whose bodies replaced the walls of their churches and spasmed beneath a scrap code forged in millennia past. The breaking of Brother Septimus, and the jubilant laughter screams he made when he renounced the silence and embraced the perfection of the cacophonous choir eternal. The mutilations of Antigone's own flesh, and the soft squelch he heard when the acolyte of the Dark Mechanicus held aloft his amputated, bloodied lips and pressed them gently to her own. A foot, placed firmly on solid earth after miles of uphill climb, the swamplands slowly draining away to desolate wastelands of weathered stone. Antigone snapped back to his own time. That last memory sensation was of the present. He had left the swamplands. He glanced about, eyes drinking in the barren brown grey of mountainous terrain. A wind whistled through winding paths that led between ice-graced peaks. Its sound was immeasurably lonely. Antigone's paused and listened. He had not heard the keening for a while, but now there was something else. Piping flutes echoed along the mountain paths, barely carrying over the wind, tonal harmonies mingling with a scratching noise that reminded Antigone's of a scribbling quill. A frantic rhythm of beaten drums accompanied the music, stirring dull sensation in the pit of Antigone's stomach. Antigone's followed the sound. Funneled between the mountains, the wind started to pick up, and with it, the distant music. Grey rain fell and splattered against Antigone's armor, long wounds opening in the clouds and spilling sheets of colorless blood. The rain soon picked up, leaking through his vox grill, tasting metallic and brackish down his mutilated throat. The rumble of thunder shook through his stomach. His eyes reflected the flash of resultant lightning across ice-graced peaks. The piping flutes accelerated their tempo, the music seeming more atonal and desperate. He found the players in the mouth of a yawning cave. They danced around a lapping bonfire, the air hot and stinking with their sweat and bodily odors. Their naked skin was painted red with ochre pigment, fashioned into strange, occultist symbols that Antigone's did not recognize from his own experimentation into damnation. Their instruments, those piping flutes and scratching drums, were of bone, creating a cacophonous half-melody that had no reason nor rhyme. The music stopped when they saw him. They shrank back from his shadow, whispering the same words again and again to themselves. Guth Samhak! Guth Samhak! A decrepit woman hobbled forwards, her breasts wrinkled folds of drooping flesh. A necklace of tiny bone flutes hung from around her neck, her hair matted knots of black. The tips of her fingers were stained with red ochre, swirling shapes painted across her emaciated stomach. The earless listener, the mouthless song, the blackness sight. Guth Samhak! Guth Samhak! The crowd crowd pushed back against the walls of the cave, scratching at their flesh and repeating their murmured chant. Only the witch remained in front of Antigone's, her wide eyes reflecting the cavorting bonfire flames and the occasional flash of fateful lightning. "Hear! Sing! See!" Antigone's brought up his sonic blaster and sang the song of the harmonic destruction. The woman did not have time to scream. Waves of pulsing sound flensed the flesh from her body, peeling it back from the musculature, which then shredded to expose disintegrating bone. She threw back her head, mouth wide open as the song exploded her internal organs and her body separated into 1,000 parts. Flecks of loose skin and bone drowned beneath a tidal wave of steaming blood. "Gutsamhak! Gutsamhak!" Antigone's turned to slaughter them too, but something stopped him. It was cave art. It had escaped Antigone's attention before, obscured by the crowd and by the old woman, but now the noise marine could see it clearly. It was him, a hulking, armored humanoid wielding a sonic blaster, frantic nail marks scratching crosses where its mouth and eyes should be, and chiseled black holes where there should have been eyes. The woman's blood had splattered across the painting, sinking into the grooves, adding vibrancy and color that shone in the brightness of the bonfire flames. There was more. Antigone stepped forward. The cave painting stretched across the far wall, depicting a tribe of mortals leading Antigone through the mountains, taking him to a forbidden place, taking him to the place where death and sound met, and embraced as friends.